Imagine this. You've been doing something your whole life, every single year, without fail, because the people who taught you everything told you to do it this way. Your parents did it. Their parents did it. The person who literally founded your entire belief system did it. Now someone knocks on your door and tells you you've been doing it all wrong. Not just wrong, dangerously wrong. Wrong enough that they are willing to cut you off forever. How do you respond? Do you bow your head and comply? Or do you stand your ground, even if it costs you everything? This is not a story about kings or armies. This is not a story about swords or blood. But make no mistake, it nearly tore apart the entire Christian world. This is the story of the Quartodeciman controversy, and almost nobody talks about it. Walk with me as I take you on another journey through the eyes of history. To understand this story, we have to go back, way back. We are talking the 1st and 2nd century AD, a time when Christianity is not the global powerhouse it eventually becomes. It is a haunted movement, a fragile network of small communities scattered across a massive, brutal Roman Empire that would gladly throw you to lions for sports. These early Christians had almost nothing: no grand cathedrals, no printing press, no internet to settle debates. What they did have were stories, passed down mouth to mouth, hand to hand, letter to letter. Stories about a man named Jesus, about his life, his death, and what his followers believed happened 3 days after. And at the center of everything, there was one day they commemorated above all others, the day they called the Passover of Christ, the death and resurrection. But here is where it gets complicated. Christianity didn't grow in a vacuum. It grew out of Judaism. Jesus himself was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. The very calendar by which they tracked holy days was Jewish. So the earliest Christians, especially those in Asia Minor, the region we now call Turkey, they kept celebrating the death of Christ on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan every single year. It didn't matter what day of the week it fell on. Monday, Tuesday, Saturday, didn't matter. The 14th of Nisan, fixed, immovable, sacred. These Christians called themselves, or rather were called the Quartodecimans, from the Latin word for 14, quartodecim, and they had rock-solid justification for their practice. They had been taught this way by the apostle John himself, the beloved disciple, the man who stood at the foot of the cross, the man who, according to Christian tradition, was closer to Jesus than almost anyone else on earth. So when somebody tells the Quartodecimans they are doing it wrong, you have to understand what they are really saying. They are not just questioning a date on a calendar, they are questioning the testimony of John the Apostle. Now, across the empire, particularly in Rome, Christians were doing things differently. They weren't tied to the 14th of Nisan. They celebrated the resurrection on a Sunday, always a Sunday, the first Sunday after the spring full moon, to be precise. Why Sunday? Because Sunday was the day they believed the resurrection happened, the day the tomb was found empty, the day that changed everything. For Roman Christians, it made perfect theological sense. Why would you tie the celebration of a resurrection to the Jewish lunar calendar? Christ had transcended the old covenant, hadn't he? The celebration should stand on its own 2 feet, a Sunday every year, marking a new dawn. For years, maybe decades, these two groups just coexisted. Different regions, different practices, same faith. It was awkward but manageable. But then came the 2nd century, and with it came two men who would turn a simmering tension into a full-blown crisis. On one side, Polycarp of Smyrna, old, revered, unshakable. Polycarp wasn't some random church elder. He was, by all accounts, a direct disciple of the Apostle John. He had sat at John's feet. He had heard John speak about the night of the Last Supper. He had carried those memories like a torch through decades of persecution. When Polycarp walked into a room, people moved. He was the kind of man whose presence made you feel like you were touching something ancient and real. And Polycarp, he was Quartodeciman through and through. The 14th of Nisan, always, no compromise. On the other side, Anicetus, the Bishop of Rome, Sunday celebration every time. Somewhere around 155 AD, these two men met face to face in Rome. Think about what this moment was. The Bishop of Rome, the most politically powerful church in the empire, sitting across from one of the last living links to the original apostles. Two men, one table, one unresolvable disagreement. And here is what makes this story extraordinary. Neither man budged, not an inch. Polycarp would not abandon the tradition of John. Anicetus would not abandon the tradition of Rome. But, and this is crucial, they didn't destroy each other. In a remarkable act of grace, Anicetus actually invited Polycarp to lead the Eucharist during his visit to Rome, a gesture of honor, of respect. They disagreed deeply, fundamentally, but they parted in peace. That peace would not survive the next generation. Fast forward to around 190 AD, a new Bishop of Rome has taken power. His name is Victor, and Victor is not interested in peaceful coexistence. Victor looks at the patchwork of Christian communities across the empire, all these different practices, different customs, different interpretations, and he sees a problem. The church, in his view, needs to speak with one voice, and that voice would speak in Latin from Rome on a Sunday. Victor decided it was time to settle the Easter question once and for all. He called a series of synods, essentially emergency councils, across different regions of the Christian world, and the verdicts from almost every region came back the same: Sunday. Almost every region, because in Asia Minor, home of the Quartodecimans, a bishop named Polycrates of Ephesus was not about to roll over. Polycrates wrote Victor a letter, and this letter is one of the most defiant documents in early Christian history. He didn't write it like a man who was afraid. He wrote it like a man who knew exactly where he stood. He listed one by one the giants of the faith who had observed the 14th of Nisan: Philip the Apostle, buried in Hierapolis; John the Apostle, the man who was beloved by the Lord; Polycarp of Smyrna, a bishop and a martyr; and 7 of his own family members who had been bishops before him. 7 generations of faithful men. Then Polycrates wrote something that should send a chill down your spine. I could mention the bishops who are present, whom you requested me to summon. I am not frightened by threats, for those greater than I have said, we must obey God rather than men. He was quoting the apostles themselves. He was telling Victor, the most powerful bishop in Christendom, I don't care who you are, I will not move. Victor's response was swift, brutal. He excommunicated the entire churches of the Asia Minor, all of them, gone, cut off, declared outside the fellowship of the universal church. Think about what that meant in that world. These weren't just disagreements in a church group chat. Excommunication meant you were spiritually severed from the body of Christ, at least in the eyes of Rome. It meant other churches might refuse to commune with you. It meant your letters might not be received. Your bishops might not be recognized. Victor had essentially declared that the churches founded on apostolic tradition, going back to John himself, were no longer legitimate. For the Quartodecimans, this was not just offensive, it was incomprehensible. They weren't heretics. They hadn't denied the resurrection. They hadn't worshipped false gods or twisted the scriptures. They had simply kept the calendar their teacher's teacher had taught them. But here's where the story takes yet another twist, because Victor's own allies turned on him. Among those who pushed back against Victor was a man named Irenaeus of Lyon. Now, Irenaeus was no friend of the Quartodeciman position. He himself celebrated Easter on Sunday. He was firmly in Victor's camp on the substance of the debates, but the method, the excommunication, that he could not stomach. Irenaeus wrote to Victor, and the word he used was extraordinary. He told Victor that this kind of heavy-handed unity was not peace, it was violence. He reminded Victor that previous bishops of Rome, including Anicetus himself, had managed to maintain fellowship with Polycarp despite their disagreements. He said, in essence, diversity of practice does not break the unity of faith. Irenaeus was trying to save the church from itself, and in doing so, he articulated something that will become one of the most important principles in Christian history: the idea that on secondary matters, the church can hold together in love, even across disagreements. Whether Victor softened his position as a result of these letters, history doesn't give us a clean answer, but the excommunication, at least in practical terms, did not fully take hold. The Asian churches continued. They were not destroyed. The story continued. For another 130 years, the controversies simmered. The Quartodecimans held their ground. Every year, on the 14th of Nisan, they gathered and remembered. Every year, the rest of the church celebrated on a Sunday. Two clocks running side by side, never quite synchronized. Then came 325 AD. The Emperor Constantine, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, convened the most important church council in history, the Council of Nicaea. You may have heard it for other reasons. It's famous for the Nicene Creed, for debates about the nature of Christ. But one of its lesser-known achievements was this: it settled the Easter question once and for all. The council decreed, with the full weight of imperial authority behind it, that Easter would be celebrated on a Sunday, universally, without exception. The Quartodeciman practice was not just outvoted, it was declared invalid. Centuries of tradition, the living memory of apostolic teaching, the testimony of men and women who had given their lives for their faith, overruled by a committee in a palace backed by an emperor. Most Quartodecimans, over time, complied. Pressure from the broader church, political reality, the sheer weight of consensus, generation after generation being told the old way was wrong. Eventually, it eroded. But not everyone. Small pockets of Quartodeciman practice persisted for centuries after Nicaea, in the shadows, in the margins, in communities that simply refused to let go of what their grandparents had taught them. By the 5th century, church fathers were still writing about Quartodeciman communities, sometimes with contempt, sometimes with a strange kind of sad bewilderment. Why wouldn't they just let it go? But you have to understand, from their perspective, they weren't being stubborn, they were being faithful. They were holding on to the thread that connected them, hand over hand, all the way back to the upper room, to the night of the Last Supper, to John leaning close to Jesus, asking, "Lord, who is it?" That thread eventually snapped, or perhaps, more accurately, it was cut, and the people who held it disappeared from history. The Quartodecimans lost, but were they wrong? The historians genuinely don't agree. What we know is this: they had apostolic backing, they had centuries of practice, they had faithful men and women who died for their beliefs and never abandoned this tradition, even under pressure. And yet, they were erased, not by violence, not by heresy, but by the slow, grinding machinery of institutional consensus. There's a quote, attributed to no one in particular, but true in its bones, that says, "History is written by the survivors." The Quartodecimans did not survive. Therefore, most of us have never heard their name until today. Thank you guys for watching. Do well to like, comment, share, subscribe, and walk with me again through the eyes of history.